5:12 a.m. local time. USS Tripoli was already inside the strait. The sea lay calm, and the early light spread across the water in hard silver bands. On the bridge, the watch moved through its normal routine. Inside the Combat Information Center, radar screens swept steadily through their cycles, clean and controlled, following merchant traffic, shoreline clutter, and the familiar compression of a narrow channel that never gave a naval ship much room to think. Then 3 tracks appeared. Fast, high performance, closing in from the northeast. At first, they were just symbols on a display, small bright marks against the layered noise of the Gulf. Then the numbers began to shift. Speed, bearing, closure rate. Everything pointed the same way, toward Tripoli. 3 fast movers bearing 048, closing. The report came out flat and exact. No wasted words, no raised voices. In a warship's command spaces, tone meant everything. Calm meant the system was doing exactly what it was built to do. The tactical action officer leaned closer to the display as the tracks tightened. The range was still long, but not comfortably long. The lead aircraft held the center line. The other 2 widened out, one sliding south, the other north, not breaking off, not drifting aimlessly, but shaping the approach into something intentional. IFF returned nothing useful. No friendly confirmation, no routine transit profile, no immediate answer to the query. Another operator checked the air picture against known schedules and regional traffic. Nothing fit. The 3 contacts kept coming, descending in stages. With each drop in altitude, they became harder to track cleanly against the cluttered horizon. On the bridge, Tripoli held course. That was the first test in water like this. Not panic, not theatrics, but recognition, confirmation, posture. The ship did not turn. It did not surge ahead. It did not flood every compartment with alarm. It stayed disciplined while the system around it shifted into a higher state of readiness. Inside CIC, the tempo changed without becoming disorderly. Consoles switched to threat monitoring. Voice circuits multiplied. Bearings were repeated. Closure calculations refreshed every few seconds, and each update sharpened the same conclusion. The aircraft were coming in too directly, too quickly, and with too much coordination to dismiss. Range, 68 miles, then 62, then 57. A warning went out on guard frequency, standard phrasing, calm and professional. No reply. The lead track dropped lower again. That was when the geometry changed. At altitude, intent could still hide behind ambiguity. At low level, in a confined waterway, fast jets no longer looked like observers. They looked like a problem with almost no time attached to it. A second warning call went out. Still nothing. At the air search console, the operator adjusted the gain and filtered the clutter. For a brief moment, the returns sharpened. 3 aircraft, tight timing, deliberate spacing, not random, not uncertain. Whoever was flying them knew exactly how to compress reaction time for the ship below. On the bridge wing, lookouts searched the brightening eastern sky. Nothing yet to the naked eye, just haze, pale light, and an empty horizon. But inside the ship, every screen said otherwise. Tripoli was not alone, and it was not blind. Data moved from sensors to watch teams to command stations with the cold efficiency expected of a Navy ship in contested waters. The defensive posture rose one level, then another. Not enough to provoke, but enough to be ready. In the aviation spaces, alert procedures began. No rushing, no shouting. Equipment was checked. Personnel moved into position. Headsets on. Safety lines clear. Everyone aboard understood the same reality without anyone having to say it aloud. In a narrow strait, with fast aircraft inbound, time was not generous. Time was a luxury. Range, 52 miles. The 3 contacts spread farther apart. One stayed centered, nose pointed at the American ship. The second widened to starboard. The third climbed slightly, then curved outward, as if building an overhead angle while keeping the formation loose enough to complicate a single response. That was not a transit pattern. That was pressure. Another radio hail went out. Another warning. Another opportunity for the approaching aircraft to identify themselves, alter course, and turn a dangerous approach into something manageable. No answer came back. Instead, one of the tracks accelerated. In CIC, every eye remained fixed on the same 3 symbols as the distance closed mile by mile. The lead aircraft was now low enough that sea return began to interfere with a clean track. That alone carried a message. Whoever sat in that cockpit understood exactly how to use the strait's compressed airspace and surface clutter to cut warning time down to the bare minimum. Then came the first visual report from topside. Aircraft in sight. Seconds later, all 3 emerged from the morning glare. Dark shapes, sharp wings, fast closure. Sir, sun behind them. One jet came straight down the ship's forward axis. The second stayed wide. The third held higher and offset, watching the entire approach unfold below. No one inside CIC needed to explain what the picture was now suggesting. 3 Iranian fighter jets had located the ship, and the first was still descending, still closing, still not turning away. 5:14 a.m. local time. By then, the uncertainty was gone. All 3 aircraft were fully visible. They were no longer distant radar returns or vague shapes lost in shoreline clutter. They were real, fast, and closing inside a strip of water too narrow for mistakes. From the bridge, the lead jet could now be tracked through binoculars. Inside CIC, every turn, descent, and separation sharpened the tactical picture even further. The geometry was unmistakable now. 1 fighter held the center line. 1 widened to starboard. The 3rd remained higher and farther out, drifting into a position that gave it a wider view of the ship, the water around it, and any move Tripoli might make. They were not arriving as one group. They were building angles. Range 2 to 4 miles. The call crossed the circuit without emotion. That was how Navy watch teams kept control when reaction time began to vanish. No dramatic language was needed. The numbers carried enough weight on their own. On the bridge, Tripoli stayed steady. Its wake remained straight. Its bow did not wander. The ship did not swing away from the threat, and it did not overcorrect into a move that would broadcast panic. That restraint mattered. In confined water, under direct aerial pressure, every heading change sent a message. A warship that moved too early looked unsure. A warship that moved too late invited something worse. Inside CIC, the air picture tightened again. Electro-optical sensors locked in with better clarity. Heat signatures, wing profile, tail arrangement, classification firmed up. Iranian fighters, armed status unknown, intent undeclared. Behavior increasingly difficult to explain away as routine. Another warning transmission went out on guard frequency. No response. The lead jet dropped lower. The change showed up immediately across every display. Altitude continued to bleed away. Speed stayed high. Nose angle remained controlled. It was not diving recklessly. It was managing its closure precisely, cutting seconds off the ship's decision window while keeping its exact purpose suspended in that narrow space between intimidation and open action. The starboard aircraft widened farther. The high aircraft adjusted in a shallow arc, not leaving the encounter but repositioning around it. Together, they were applying pressure from 3 directions at once. 1 dead ahead, 1 off the beam, 1 above and outside. For a ship moving through Hormuz, that was enough to turn a contact into a tactical problem. Possible multi-axis pressure profile. The assessment came from CIC in clipped language, neither exaggerated nor softened. It needed no interpretation. The formation was no longer simply approaching Tripoli. It was arranging itself around the ship's response envelope. Out on the weather decks, sailors kept their eyes skyward. The morning had brightened now. Sunlight slashed across the water, throwing glare off the chop and washing color from the horizon. Against that brightness, the fighters appeared and disappeared in quick, sharp flashes. Dark shapes moving faster than the eye wanted to believe. Each burst of light off canopy and wing made them seem closer than they had been a moment before. The lead aircraft came lower still, too low for comfort, too low for any honest misunderstanding. A safe, professional overflight could have been done higher, wider, and clearly separated from the ship's track. This was not that. It was a boundary being approached deliberately, step by step, with just enough restraint to keep final intent unspoken. In the ship's aviation spaces, readiness deepened again. Flight deck crews moved with control. No running, no clustering, no wasted motion. Equipment was checked once more. Communications stayed crisp. The ship's own air options were being readied, not because Tripoli had chosen to raise the stakes, but because in encounters like this, readiness had to exist long before authorization ever arrived. Range, 18 miles. The starboard fighter suddenly accelerated. Its movement differed from the lead aircraft's disciplined inbound profile. This one cut laterally, fast and low, sweeping wider off Tripoli's side as if testing how the ship handled separated pressure points. The higher jet held its altitude just long enough to keep the formation uneven. It was a small shift, but inside CIC the effect was immediate. More angles, more timing questions, more ways for a harmless pass to become something far less simple. Then came the first low run, not directly over the ship, not yet. The lead fighter flattened its approach and drove in along the forward sector at an altitude low enough that every sensor operator had to take the move seriously. Faint spray kicked beneath it where disturbed air brushed the sea. Its speed stayed high. Its nose remained steady. It did not break left. It did not break right. Bridge watch teams tracked it by sight. CIC tracked it by numbers. Both saw the same thing. The aircraft was holding the approach longer than a mere show of presence required. Another warning transmission went out. Silence. No call sign. No acknowledgement. No change in profile. Range, 14 miles. The starboard fighter tightened in. The high aircraft began a broader curve, almost relaxed at first glance, but dangerous in its timing. If the lead jet forced attention forward, the other two were positioning to stretch that attention outward and upward. That was the pressure now gathering over Tripoli. Not one problem, but one problem multiplied by uncertainty. Then one of the sensor operators said it. Possible threat profile. Nobody repeated it for effect. Nobody had to. On the bridge, the captain listened, watched, and kept the ship exactly where it needed to be. Steady enough to project authority, ready enough to survive the next 10 seconds if the next 10 seconds turned bad. Ahead of the ship, the lead Iranian fighter was no longer making a broad pass. It was driving straight in, and now it looked less like a warning run and more like the opening move of something far more serious. 5:18 a.m. local time. That was the moment Tripoli stopped treating the encounter as a dangerous approach and started treating it as a controlled tactical event. Not panic, not a scramble, a transition. Inside CIC, the ship's posture rose with almost mechanical precision. Consoles that had been tracking closure shifted into a fuller defensive picture. Air tracks were no longer just inbound contacts. They were assigned, measured, and held inside a layered grid of time, bearing, speed, and response options. Every move the three jets made was now being captured, compared, and interpreted in real time. The lead fighter remained the central problem. Still low, still forward, still closing inside an approach profile that no longer resembled routine military transit. But the other two mattered just as much. One stayed out to starboard, forcing the ship to respect the beam. The third remained higher and farther off, holding enough altitude to watch the entire space below. Together, they were trying to do what fast aircraft always tried to do against a large ship in confined waters: compress attention, split reaction, and force a mistake. Tripoli gave them none. Track all three, maintain full continuity. The order was short and immediate. No target was allowed to fade into the background while the lead aircraft absorbed the ship's attention. CIC held the full pattern at once. That was where a U.S. warship became dangerous. Not in noise, not in spectacle, but in discipline. Across the ship, systems came fully alive. Air search continued feeding the broader picture. Electro-optical sensors stayed locked on the most aggressive aircraft, extracting every possible detail from angle, heat, silhouette, and movement. Electronic warfare operators began pulling signatures from the encounter: brief emissions, intermittent sweeps, timing behavior, sensor use. Even if nothing was launched and nothing was fired, the aircraft were already revealing something valuable: their habits, their spacing, their confidence, their doctrine. On the bridge, Tripoli still held course. That decision carried more weight now than it had before. The ship had every reason to advertise alarm. It did not. Its wake remained even. Its bow stayed level. Anyone watching from those Iranian cockpits would see the same message. The American ship below them was not breaking posture, not scattering its movement, not broadcasting confusion into the sky. That mattered because intimidation only worked when the other side looked intimidated. In the aviation spaces, readiness tightened by another degree. Personnel moved into exact positions. Communications checks were completed. Safety boundaries were confirmed. Launching was not yet the point. Preparedness was. A ship like Tripoli did not need to show every card in the first minute. It only needed the other side to understand that there were more cards than they could see. Lead aircraft steady inbound, starboard aircraft tightening, high aircraft maintaining offset. The update came through in clipped sequence. On the tactical display, the pressure was clear now. One jet shaping the front, one testing lateral space, one preserving altitude and perspective. It was coordinated enough to matter, yet restrained enough to deny openly hostile action. That was the edge of encounters like this. Nothing fired, nothing released. And still, a warship could feel the full weight of danger. The lead aircraft made another low run. This one was closer. Its line across the forward sector cut sharply enough to trigger immediate recalculations at every console. Closure time, turn radius, engagement envelope, likely brake direction. Even if the aircraft carried no visible payload, the move had to be treated with full seriousness. At that altitude and speed, there would be no generous pause between intent and consequence. But now there was a difference. The jet was no longer the only side doing the measuring. Every second it remained close, Tripoli learned more. Sensor response, approach discipline, altitude control, time spent inside specific arcs, whether the pilot trusted speed, surprise, or proximity, whether the second and third jets were moving independently or keying off the lead aircraft's behavior. This was no longer just a ship under pressure. It was also a ship collecting a pattern. The starboard fighter drove lower, not as low as the lead, not yet, but low enough to reinforce the message. It was not there for safety. It was there to stretch the ship sideways, to force attention across two planes at once. Above them, the third aircraft shifted again, a subtle turn that suggested support, oversight, or simply the intent to keep the American crew looking in 3 directions at once. Still, Tripoli did not flinch. No erratic maneuver, no rushed escalation, only visible readiness. On deck and inside the island, that readiness spoke through quiet signs. Crew at stations, sensors fixed, timing compressed, procedures already complete before the next order could even be spoken. This was what control looked like aboard a U.S. Navy warship. Not loud, not theatrical, just complete. Then something changed. At first it was slight, a hesitation in the pattern. The lead jet remained aggressive, but the formation behind it lost some of its earlier smoothness. The starboard aircraft adjusted a fraction late. The high aircraft widened more than before. Nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest that the pilots above had begun to understand what the ship below was showing them. They had been seen, fully measured, in real time. And whatever advantage they had hoped to create through speed and intimidation was beginning to thin. One more low pass came off the bow. One more hard, deliberate show of force. But it no longer landed the same way. Because by then, the pressure over Hormuz had begun to shift. The 3 Iranian fighters were still searching for angles, but now they knew the ship beneath them was tracking every one of those angles right back. 5:21 a.m. local time. By then, the encounter had narrowed to 1 aircraft. All 3 Iranian fighters were still in the air picture. All 3 still mattered, but only one now carried the full weight of the moment, the lead jet. It had been the first to descend, the first to hold the forward axis, the first to remain just a little too long inside every dangerous line. Now it came in again, low, fast, direct. On Tripoli's displays, the geometry was no longer ambiguous. The aircraft was not conducting a broad area show of presence. It was driving into a profile that forced the ship to treat every second as a threshold. The starboard fighter remained outside, lower than before, keeping pressure on the beam. The third aircraft stayed high and offset, preserving altitude and distance, watching the event unfold from above. But the center of gravity had moved forward. Everything now depended on what the lead pilot did next. Inside CIC, no one needed to be told that the margin was gone. Timing updates came faster. Closure windows shortened. Every estimate of intent was now being measured against the same brutal fact. In confined water, against a low, fast jet, there was almost no space left between intimidation and irreversible error. Lead aircraft continuing inbound. The report crossed the circuit in a voice that remained level, even as the numbers behind it kept tightening. On the bridge, the captain stood with the same outward calm he had held since the first detection. The ship's course remained steady. No hard turn, no visible crack in confidence. That mattered now more than ever. If Tripoli moved too sharply, it could feed the very escalation it was trying to control. If it moved too late, it risked allowing the aircraft to define the moment for everyone. So the ship did what trained warships do under pressure. It stayed exact. The lead fighter dropped lower again. Not enough to touch the sea, but enough to turn proximity into pressure. Its nose remained aligned longer than before. That was what caught attention inside CIC. A routine intimidation pass would have broken earlier. A disciplined pilot signaling force without pressing the final boundary would usually widen just enough to preserve distance and intent. This aircraft did neither. It held the line. It held the bow. It kept coming. Possible hostile intent if profile continues. No one in CIC raised a voice after that. None was needed. The phrase carried everything required. It was not a declaration. It was a line drawn around behavior. Continue this. Stay on this angle. Remain inside this closure window. And the ship's interpretation changes. The starboard fighter tightened in response. Its move was subtle but dangerous. Not a rush, not a dive. A controlled inward shift that widened the burden on the ship below. Now the Americans had 1 aircraft pressing the bow and another leaning closer off the side, while the third remained high enough to watch the full reaction arc. It was a classic pressure stack, front, flank, overwatch, designed to stretch attention and compress decision. But even then, Tripoli did not fracture. Track continuity remained clean. Sensor lock stayed steady. Electronic surveillance kept pulling fragments out of the encounter, one brief signal at a time. If the pilots above believed speed and aggression would give them the advantage, they were already learning something different. The closer they came, the more they revealed. Then the lead fighter pushed 1 step further. It came down the forward sector at a range and altitude no professional warship could ignore. From the bridge, the aircraft no longer looked like a distant shape against the sun. It had form now, structure, control surfaces, visible intent. Inside CIC, the closure numbers compressed into a timeline that left no room for comfort. Seconds, not many. Maintain readiness. The order moved through the ship with the same cold precision as everything before it. No panic, no drama, just the understanding that the next change in that aircraft's path might decide whether the morning ended as a tense encounter or something far harder to contain. Above the strait, the lead jet kept pressing. At that distance, confidence and miscalculation were separated by less than a second. The nose stayed steady. The altitude remained low. The aircraft seemed committed to forcing a reaction to prove that a U.S. warship, constrained by narrow water, would hesitate under pressure from above. Then the rhythm broke. Not with a shot, not with an explosion, with realization. It showed first in timing. The lead aircraft held its line just a fraction too long, then corrected, slightly at first, then more sharply. The kind of correction a pilot makes when they realize they've pushed closer than intended and are running out of safe geometry. Behind it, the starboard jet adjusted as well. Not as clean, not as confident as before. Above them, the third fighter widened its arc. For the first time that morning, the formation looked reactive, not in control. The lead jet was now too deep inside the ship's forward picture to maintain the illusion of dominance. Continue for one more second, and the encounter risked crossing into territory neither side could manage cleanly. Brake now, and the pressure run lost its effect. The pilot chose to brake, hard. The fighter snapped away from the bow in a sharp, aggressive turn, climbing just enough to clear its own risk while leaving behind a moment that hung over the ship like the echo of something that almost happened. The starboard aircraft peeled wider almost immediately. The third, still higher, shifted out with them. Nothing had been fired. No system had been activated beyond readiness. But no one aboard Tripoli would mistake what had just unfolded for routine. It had come close enough for everyone involved to understand exactly where the line was, and exactly how near one pilot had come to crossing it. 5:24 a.m. local time. The break came fast. One moment, the lead Iranian fighter was pulling hard away from Tripoli's bow, exiting the most dangerous geometry of the morning. The next, the rest of the formation was following. The starboard aircraft widened first, abandoning the tight lateral pressure it had held over the ship's side. The third jet, higher and farther out, rolled into a broader arc and began drifting away from the encounter altogether. Just like that, the shape over the strait began to change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough. Inside CIC, no one mistook movement for safety. All three tracks remained under watch. All three continued to be measured. Altitude, heading, rate of turn, separation. The ship did not relax simply because the aircraft turned away. It observed the departure the same way it had observed the approach, with discipline, continuity, and the understanding that in waters like Hormuz, a retreat could reverse just as quickly. Lead aircraft opening range. The report came through in the same calm voice that had tracked the situation from the beginning. It sounded almost routine. That was intentional. Professional crews didn't celebrate when tension eased. They confirmed it, logged it, and stayed ready in case it returned. On the bridge, Tripoli remained exactly what it had been throughout the encounter. Steady, its bow still aligned with the transit lane, its wake still cutting clean through narrow water. The ship did not turn to follow the aircraft. It did not accelerate to emphasize control. It did not try to turn a defensive moment into a display. It simply held the sea. That was enough. Across the ship, systems remained active as the range widened. Radar continued tracking the three fighters as they pulled away. Electro-optical sensors held them until distance, and light reduced them back to shapes. Electronic warfare teams continued recording emissions and timing behavior, building a clearer picture of what the morning had revealed. And it had revealed more than just a safe outcome. The three jets had come close enough, stayed long enough, and maneuvered aggressively enough to leave behind something every warship valued. A pattern, how they approached, how they separated, which aircraft pressed hardest, which one held altitude, how they adjusted when the ship refused to react. How quickly their confidence shifted once it became clear that Tripoli was not a passive presence in the water, but a fully integrated combat platform measuring every second of the encounter right back at them. For the pilots above, it had been a show of force. For the ship below, it had also become a data event. The lead aircraft widened further. Now the formation was no longer built around Tripoli. It was built around leaving the moment behind. The pressure on the bow was gone. The lateral pressure faded. The overhead position dissolved with the rest. The three fighters still shared the same sky, but they no longer controlled its center. Tripoli did. In the aviation spaces, readiness did not drop with the tension. Equipment stayed in place. Personnel remained at stations. No one aboard had seen anything that justified relaxing into assumption. The strait was still narrow, the coastline still close, the environment still one of the most compressed operating spaces on Earth. There would be time later to review everything in detail. For now, the only acceptable posture was control. Range increasing through 20 miles. For the first time since 0512, the numbers were moving in the ship's favor. Distance was returning. Space. Not much, but enough. Above the horizon, the Iranian fighters continued outward, maintaining just enough discipline in their departure to preserve appearances. They didn't scatter. They didn't rush. They turned away like aircraft that wanted the moment to be remembered as deliberate. But intent was no longer theirs to define alone. Too much had already been seen. Too much had already been recorded. Data was being preserved. Sensor histories reviewed. Timeline markers already forming in the background. Bearings, ranges, altitude changes, low passes, unanswered warnings, the final close approach, the sharp break away from the bow. Every second mattered. Not because anything had been fired, but because nothing had. No missile trails crossed the strait, no defensive systems engaged, no wreckage marked the water. And still, everyone involved had come close enough to understand how little it would have taken to change the ending. One more second on the same line, a slightly later break, a sharper reaction, a worse decision in a cockpit. That was all it would have taken. But that was not what happened. What happened instead was simpler, colder, and in some ways more revealing. 3 Iranian fighter jets pressed a U.S. warship inside one of the tightest waterways on Earth. USS Tripoli did not panic. It did not lose the picture. It did not give up control to speed, noise, or proximity. It tracked, it measured, it held. And when the moment came, the aircraft turned away first. By 5:30 a.m. local time, the immediate pressure had passed. The fighters were opening range. The transit continued. From the bridge, the sea looked almost unchanged. The same light, the same narrow channel, the same steady movement along the coast. But nothing aboard Tripoli treated the morning as routine. Because anyone who had watched those jets descend through the glare, shape their approach, press the bow, and then break away at the last second, knew exactly what it had been. In Hormuz, a confrontation doesn't have to begin to show who holds control. That morning, the answer came without a single shot. Tripoli held its course, and the sky stepped back.